What would you do if the woman sitting next to you, who did nothing wrong, caused no disturbance, broke no rules, was asked to give up her seat simply because she didn't look like someone who belonged there? There was no shouting, no argument. No one pulled out a phone to defend her. Just one glance from a flight attendant, a frown from the passenger across the aisle, and a request, light as air, yet sharp enough to cut through dignity. Ma'am, would you mind switching to a seat in the back? That day, Orion Air Flight 173 from Dallas to Seattle took off right on time. No one in the economy cabin knew they were about to witness a quiet, seismic moment, one that would force America's airline policies to be rewritten from the ground up. Seat 21C that day belonged to a quiet woman. No one knew her name. No one stood up for her. But 43 days later, her name was spoken at a national press conference. And 3 months later, a new training program was rolled out across every major airline, named the Monroe Protocol. There was nothing remarkable about the woman quietly seated in 21C on Skylink's flight, SEL 217, departing from Dallas to Seattle. She wore a light gray hoodie with slightly frayed cuffs, dark jeans, and white sneakers stained by time. Her curly hair was neatly tied into a low bun at the nape of her neck, tidy to the point of being unnoticeable. She wore oversized glasses, whether prescription or just a shield from attention was unclear. A worn paperback novel rested on her lap, opened halfway but clearly unread. Her hands were clasped together, her eyes occasionally drifting toward the window. To most passengers, she was just another quiet black woman, reserved and unremarkable. And that was exactly what she wanted. Her real name was Danielle Monroe. But today she was Dana Milton, a name borrowed from her old college roommate. No one on this flight knew that the silent woman in the economy seat was, in fact, the chief executive officer of Skylinks Airlines itself, one of the largest carriers in North America, with tens of thousands of employees and over 170 destinations. Danielle had graced the cover of Forbes, spoken at global conferences, and had been hailed as a trailblazer for women of color in aviation, an industry long dominated by white men. But today, she wasn't that emblematic figure. Today, she was just another passenger, on the ground, not in the boardroom, observing from below rather than above. Because after too many polished reports and too many filtered satisfaction metrics, Danielle had begun to sense that something was rotting within the system she was leading. This was her fifth covert flight under a personal initiative called Operation Horizon, a campaign she launched herself to assess Skylinks' true service quality through the eyes of an ordinary passenger. No internal memos, no media. Even the board had no knowledge of these flights. She drove a rental car to the airport, printed her ticket at the kiosk, stood in line like everyone else. No priority, no lounge, no privileges. Just her and whatever her own airline truly delivered to its customers. The tall man in seat 21D stepped into the row, nodded politely at her. Danielle offered a small smile, nodded back, but said nothing. Experience had taught her, the less she spoke, the more others revealed their true selves. She scanned the cabin, evaluating the space with the eyes of someone who once began her career in cargo, wiping smudges off window frames. This was a retrofitted 737 MAX, clean, but clearly no longer new. The seat fabric showed faint stains. The armrest between 21B and 21C had a small crack, and the overhead bin creaked with every opening. Danielle mentally logged each detail. She had boarded early enough to observe the entire boarding process. The gate agent, a young woman named Lexi, was polite and efficient, even when the ticket printer jammed and she had to help a family with several small children. Danielle made a mental note of her, but her eyes soon shifted to the cabin. There were two flight attendants covering the economy section, a middle-aged woman with graying curls and a tired but sincere smile, and a younger blonde woman with a sharp ponytail, sharp features, and even sharper impatience. The name tag read, Taylor. The older woman, Cassidy, moved slowly but surely, proactively helping passengers. Taylor, though silent, radiated coldness, detachment bordering on disdain. Danielle didn't rush to judgment. She wasn't looking for perfection. She was looking for signs. Taylor wasn't the first to carry that demeanor, but something in her gaze warranted special attention. It wasn't simple arrogance. It was superiority, as if passengers were inconveniences to be managed. Taylor was the type of flight attendant no report could ever expose. She knew when to smile, recited the safety briefing word for word, followed procedures to the letter. But what she didn't do, the way she didn't help a mother with a stroller, didn't smile when handing over water, was what truly revealed the inner culture Danielle was trying to uncover. As the plane taxied, Danielle leaned back into her seat, eyes half closed. The engines roared, a sound she'd known since childhood, when she used to accompany her father on late-night shifts at the airport. Her father had been a Skylinks baggage handler for nearly 20 years, the man who taught her to love the sky from the lowest rung on the ground. That love had propelled her to study economics, intern, and climb every ladder until she became the most powerful woman in a place that once didn't want someone like her in it. Today's flight was just another field check. She expected nothing dramatic, until the drink cart stopped in front of her. Taylor was pushing the cart. Her face was blank as usual. No greeting, no eye contact. "What do you want?" Her tone flat, her eyes already looking toward the next row. Danielle replied gently, "Tomato juice, please." "Thank you." A slight eyebrow raise flickered across Taylor's face, a look that was part surprise, part contempt. She grabbed the can, cracked it open, scooped ice into a cup, holding it loosely, and at that moment, the plane gave a light tremor. Just a routine bump, like hundreds of other flights. But her unstable grip tipped the can slightly, and the entire dark red liquid spilled onto Danielle. Cold tomato juice soaked her hoodie, ran down her jeans, and drenched the book on her lap. A few drops hit her cheek. Her entire upper body was wet, cold, sticky. But what chilled her more was the laugh that followed. Taylor didn't gasp in embarrassment. She didn't reflexively say, "I'm sorry." Instead, she laughed. A real laugh. Not from awkwardness, not from nerves, but from amusement. "Well, that's probably a new record," Taylor snorted, hand over mouth, eyes gleaming with glee. Then she turned her head and shouted forward, "Cass! You won't believe what I just did." The cabin froze for a moment. The man to Danielle's right looked up from his laptop. The girl by the window pulled out her earbuds. Danielle looked down at the spreading red stain on her shirt, then raised her eyes and stared directly at Taylor. Not with anger, not with shock. Just a calm, unwavering gaze that cut through Taylor's half-smile like someone confirming a long-held suspicion. "Could I have some napkins, please?" she asked softly. Taylor gave a slight shake of the head, shrugged as if doing a favor, then rummaged through the cart and pulled out a few flimsy napkins, no better than cocktail tissues, tossing them onto Danielle's lap. "Here." No blanket, no soda, no apology, just rolled the cart forward as if completing a routine chore. Danielle picked up the napkins and dabbed at the mess. They disintegrated instantly. She was cold, soaked, but said nothing. In her mind, she was no longer a passenger. She was an observer, and the person she had just observed had unknowingly signed her own professional death certificate. Taylor Vaughn didn't hate her job. She just saw it as a means to an end, a temporary rung on the ladder, a stage where she still had to perform every day, and most importantly, a place where she could prove she held some power, however small or limited. To Taylor, the passenger cabin wasn't a place of service. It was a place of control. She didn't become a flight attendant to take care of people. She chose this profession to remind herself that at the very least, in this cramped sky, someone still had to step aside when she walked through. And if a passenger, like the woman in seat 21C, had the audacity to make her feel awkward over a tiny accident, it wasn't worth apologizing for, because she didn't feel she was wrong. It was just a light bump, a little juice, and a fragile, overly sensitive passenger. People Taylor had encountered far too many times on flights like this. Cassidy Dean was different. She'd worked in aviation for over 23 years. Since the days of paper tickets and plug-in headphones, she'd served red-eye flights through snowstorms, carried babies for overwhelmed parents, and sat silently holding the hand of an elderly woman mourning a lost loved one on a flight home. To Cassidy, this wasn't just a job, it was a calling. Something she chose, not for fame, not for money, but because she believed air travel was a space where people needed gentleness the most. The skies were already cold and isolating, So her job was to bring a little warmth, a little order to the chaos. Cassidy knew Taylor was the type of crew member the modern airline industry was churning out more and more of: young, attractive, fast, efficient, and impatient. She had seen many Taylors come and go. Some were promoted quickly because they knew how to say the right thing to the right person. Others were reported and disappeared after a few months. Taylor was the former: smart, sharp-tongued, skilled at dodging blame and redirecting mistakes. And more than anything, Taylor didn't believe in kindness, at least not if it didn't serve her interests. Cassidy didn't hate Taylor, but she was wary. The coldness was too overt, the contempt too blatant, and the lack of restraint too dangerous, especially when she was pushing a drink cart with such a loose grip. Cassidy had considered saying something, but held back. Years of experience had taught her that speaking up was pointless if the other person wasn't willing to listen. When the juice incident happened, Cassidy heard Taylor's voice ring out from the front of the cabin. "Cass, you won't believe what I just did." Cassidy quickly walked down the aisle, arriving to find the woman in seat 21C soaked. Taylor stood there with a half smile, as if recounting a well-delivered punchline. Cassidy felt a pang. She saw the tomato juice stain had spread across the passenger's shirt. Her eyes glanced up and met the woman's gaze. There was no anger, no outburst, just a chilling calm. It was the kind of look Cassidy had only ever seen in those who had been misjudged too many times, and no longer expected kindness from anyone. Cassidy spoke softly. "We should get her a blanket." Taylor rolled her eyes. "Economy blankets are out. First-class blankets aren't to be handed out randomly. Rules are rules, you know that." Cassidy hesitated. "Then at the very least, we should apologize." Taylor shrugged and pushed the cart forward. "I said clumsy me already. Isn't that enough?" Cassidy paused, then quietly walked back to the galley. She pulled a clean face towel from her personal travel pouch, something she carried for long-haul flights, and returned to seat 21C. But the woman gave a slight shake of the head, as if signaling she didn't want anyone else near her. Cassidy took a step back and silently slipped the towel between the seats without saying a word. Taylor didn't care. She returned to the galley and began recounting her comedic moment to Cassidy. "You saw that?" She asked for a form. "A complaint form. On a plane. Like I'm some customer service rep on the ground or something. It's just a spilled cup of juice, not sulfuric acid." Cassidy didn't respond. Taylor continued, her voice lower now. "She's kind of weird, wearing that baggy gray hoodie, looking like she's homeless, but acting all proper like she's VIP or something. Who knows? Maybe she's one of those special types." That last line faded into silence, but Cassidy heard it clearly. Special, a coded word, a euphemism for people of color, a label Taylor used to conceal her quiet disdain. Cassidy looked at Taylor, unable to hide her disappointment for the first time. "I think she's not who you think she is." Taylor scoffed. "Oh, please, don't tell me you believe in female intuition. That's adorable." She spoke while pulling out her phone, scrolling through TikTok for a few minutes before prepping for the next service round. Cassidy returned to the cabin, but her heart was uneasy. There was something about that woman that weighed heavy on her. Maybe it was the look in her eyes, the look of someone used to being overlooked. But this time, those eyes were remembering. As for Taylor, she suspected nothing. To her, everything was business as usual. She was still the queen of the economy cabin, where a few sharp comebacks, well-timed eye rolls, and a smirk were all it took to hold her ground. She had lived by that formula since she started working, and so far it had worked. She didn't know that in the very moment that juice spilled on that passenger, she had just wiped away her last lifeline. She didn't know she wasn't just facing a passenger, but the highest-ranking figure in the entire company she worked for. But Cassidy, deep down she sensed something was coming, a silent spiral, something bigger than both of them, bigger than the flight itself. Danielle sat motionless, her hands still gripping the thin cocktail napkins Taylor had coldly and dismissively tossed onto her lap. The cold, sticky dampness seeped through the fabric of her hoodie and clung to her skin, sending a chill down her back. But it wasn't as cold as the look she'd received from Taylor. A gaze laced with mockery and indifference. as if the woman seated before her didn't even merit a basic, decent apology. Danielle gently dabbed at the trickling juice on her collar, but the more she dabbed, the more it spread. The book in her lap, a worn paperback copy of The Warmth of Other Suns, was soaked, its cover wrinkled like her emotions at that very moment. Tense, cold, and voiceless. Taylor rolled the card away, not even glancing back, mumbling something under her breath, her head shaking slightly as if she'd just dealt with a minor inconvenience. Danielle said nothing. She felt a fury rising, but not the kind that makes someone jump up and shout. It was the slow-burning, breath-choking kind. Her dignity wasn't crushed by some overt act of violence, but by a series of small, cutting details. A laugh, a shrug, a glance that said, whatever. The man in seat 21D awkwardly unzipped his travel bag, pulled out a small pack of wet wipes, and handed it to Danielle without saying a word. She took it and nodded gently in thanks. That wasn't right, he muttered, still avoiding her eyes. Just a simple sentence, but it was the only thing since the flight began that made Danielle feel like she wasn't completely invisible. She wiped her hands softly, then returned the wipes to her tray, her head spinning. Most of the prior flights under Operation Horizon had remained within the bounds of light observation. A curt flight attendant, an inattentive ground agent, a few complaints about food or seating, but this was different. This wasn't just poor service. This was humiliation. And it wasn't aimed at Dana Milton, the alias used to book the ticket. It was aimed at a black woman in a worn hoodie, sitting in economy, carrying nothing outwardly special. A woman whom Taylor Vaughn had instinctively judged as irrelevant, and therefore undeserving of respect. Danielle recalled the moment the juice can tilted. She had seen it coming seconds in advance, but she hadn't moved, hadn't flinched. Maybe deep down, she wanted to see what would happen when a service worker forgot that the person in front of them was human. And Taylor had answered, without filter, without disguise. That raw truth chilled Danielle more than the juice ever could. Just a few rows from the rear galley, Danielle could hear everything between the two attendants through the thin curtain that separated them. Taylor's voice rang out clearly. Did you see her face? Like I just poured acid on her or something. It was just a bit of tomato juice, not the end of the world. Cassidy's voice was softer, replying, I think she was in shock. You didn't really apologize. Taylor laughed. What, you wanted me to get on my knees and wipe her shoes? I said sorry. Some people just love to make a scene, probably trying to milk it for a free flight. Each word felt like a needle pricking the back of Danielle's neck. She sat still, her ears missing nothing. Taylor went on, her voice dropping but still razor sharp. And did you notice her attitude from the start? That I know my rights vibe, the type that screams the moment you touch them. I call that playing the victim card. You touch them, and suddenly you're the villain. Cassidy said nothing. The air in the galley dipped a degree. Danielle could hear Cassidy's soft sigh, followed by the twist of a water bottle cap. But what froze Danielle wasn't Taylor's words. It was Cassidy's silence. She didn't push back, didn't interrupt. She let the disrespect pass unchallenged, as if it were an unavoidable part of the job. Danielle slowly closed her eyes, but her mind wasn't in the cabin anymore. It was calculating. She thought through her next steps. She remembered the name of the gate agent who'd handled boarding. She remembered the aircraft number. She remembered the seat row, flight time, weather conditions, the exact moment the turbulence hit. Everything. The brain of a CEO operated like a surveillance radar. No data ever goes to waste. But she didn't act yet, because she knew if she exposed Taylor here, in front of passengers, all she'd receive was a performance, a staged apology. Taylor would panic. She'd say sorry. She'd bow her head, and then she'd spin it into a misunderstanding. The truth would get watered down, and worst of all, the system would defend itself by punishing one individual while leaving the roots untouched. Danielle didn't want to prune a rotten branch. She wanted to pull up the entire root. She gently adjusted her posture, fastened her seatbelt, and pulled out her phone, a dummy device with no connection beyond the internal network. But in her mind, a blueprint was already forming, step by step. Taylor might not know it yet, But she had just entered a real performance review. And the woman she had laughed at, disrespected over a small stain, was the very one who now held her future in the palm of her hand, with nothing more than a nod. Taylor's laugh wasn't loud, but it carried a frightening kind of reach. It burst out like a small firecracker in a windless night, waking up even the drowsiest passengers, prompting those with headphones to take them off. It wasn't the laugh of someone embarrassed by a professional mishap. It was the laugh of someone who found what had just happened funny, deserved, even entertaining. That laugh echoed through the cabin like an invisible signal, drawing a sharp line between who was to be served and who was meant to endure. Danielle sat still. She could feel all the eyes flicking toward her, then darting away. A few people glanced over briefly before quickly lowering their eyes to their phones. Some looked uncomfortable, but no one said a word. Not a single voice of protest. Not one person asked, "Are you okay?" The silence spread like the tiny bubbles in the tomato juice now chilling on her skin. Slow, sticky, abrasive. Danielle didn't expect anyone to speak up for her. She'd been in situations like this since childhood, when a little black girl was labeled slow just for not speaking English with the right accent, when her mother was told to use the service entrance at the mall because she had mistakenly entered the VIP corridor. She knew what it meant to be judged by appearances alone, and she had learned to stay quiet, not out of fear, but because she was listening. And right now she was listening clearly, very clearly. Taylor kept pushing the cart but glanced back at Danielle as if admiring a performance she had just staged. She whispered something to Cassidy, still chuckling, and the two quickly slipped into the rear galley. Danielle heard the curtain draw shut, then their whispers resumed, still audible through the thin fabric. "She's probably going to send a 3-page email after the flight, like, 'I felt deeply offended by a cup of juice.' I've dealt with 100 passengers like that," Cassidy replied gently, trying to ease the tension. She didn't raise her voice or anything. Taylor scoffed. Exactly why it's dangerous. That type, silent and scary, could be a journalist or some human rights crusader or whatever. Danielle narrowed her eyes. Within seconds, Taylor had gone from ridicule to suspicion, already constructing defensive narratives in her head. She sensed something was off, but instead of reflecting, she blamed. She deserved it. Danielle looked down at the still wet tomato stain. It wasn't just juice anymore. It was a mark. A reminder that even if you run an entire airline system, all it takes is a change of clothes, a different name, and a regular economy seat for you to instantly become a target of casual contempt. She wasn't angry about the spill. She was angry about how easily the disregard happened, just because she didn't carry a symbol of authority, just because she didn't look like someone who belonged there. Danielle had seen situations like this before, in reports. Passenger complaints dismissed, reduced to minor incidents. But now she wasn't reading the report. She was living it. And that laugh, the one that should have been an apology, was the spark. It made her realize that you can't reform a system through PowerPoint slides. You can't clean up culture with an email. Change begins by holding people accountable for laughs like that. Laughs that weren't about humor, but about humiliation. A few minutes later, Cassidy returned to the cabin, making her way toward Danielle. She held a light blue blanket, the thin kind usually handed out during night flights, and bent down slightly. "I brought this for you if you're cold." Danielle looked at her, then gently shook her head. It wasn't because she didn't need the blanket. It was because no object could soothe the storm of emotion burning inside her. Cassidy paused for a moment, as if wanting to say something more, then turned away. A child a few rows behind asked his mother, "Mom, why is that lady's shirt all red?" The mother hurriedly whispered something, pulling his head gently away. Danielle closed her eyes and leaned back in her seat, but she didn't sleep. In her mind, lines of directives were forming. Trace the flight attendant's ID. Pull the flight data. Log the turbulence timestamp. Collect evidence. Build the report. What had once been a vague investigation now had a sharp focus. Tiffany Vaughn, the flight attendant, who wasn't just careless, but deeply indifferent. No one knew that the woman wiping a stain with flimsy napkins was the very person who would determine the future of this airline. No one knew that seat 21C today didn't belong to just another passenger, but to the person drafting the new training protocols for the entire company. And that laugh, the one that seemed like a moment of petty release, was, in truth, the last laugh before the storm. The thin curtain at the rear of the cabin swayed gently with the vibration of the plane. The rear galley, normally seen as the backstage corner of a flight, had now become the epicenter of everything Danielle needed to hear. She didn't try to eavesdrop, but she didn't need to. The curtain was so thin that with just a bit of focus, every whisper came through clearly. Just a few rows away, in a space where people assumed no one was worth minding, they said everything. And Taylor, as if forgetting that the ears of the woman in seat 21C weren't just tuned to music or engine noise, was gradually revealing her true self. "You know what?" Taylor said, her voice louder than usual. "I bet she's totally going to send a complaint email. For sure. People like that always know how to write. Those dramatic essays like, 'I'm a victim,' 'I felt humiliated,' all that crap." Cassidy replied with a vague sigh. Not agreement, not protest. Taylor didn't care. She continued, her voice now mocking. "But wait, what if she's a journalist? Or one of those passenger rights watchdogs? Wears a hoodie, big glasses, just begging someone to ask, 'Are you okay?' So she can spin it into a whole expose about airline discrimination." Seen it before. Danielle sat still, eyes forward, but her mind tunneled into every syllable. Taylor wasn't just unprofessional. She was prejudiced. The kind of prejudice that didn't need to be named. Just observe how she dissected people. Their clothes, their voice, their skin, their seat, all became tools she used to categorize, judge, and ultimately belittle. Cassidy spoke, quiet but clear. "I think she was just in shock. She didn't even say much. Honestly, her reaction was pretty mild." Taylor sneered. "You're too nice, Cass. That whole silent sufferer thing. That's not gentleness. That's timing. Trust me, I've met tons like her." Then she lowered her voice, but not low enough. "And you know, those types always know how to play the victim card, especially when well, you know what I mean." Cassidy stayed silent, and that's when Danielle knew for certain. Taylor didn't just have issues with customers. She had issues with skin color, with presentation, with anything that didn't fit her unspoken standard of deserving. A black woman in a hoodie sitting in seat 21C for Taylor didn't match polite service. She was a red flag. She was out of place. A chill ran down Danielle's spine, not from the now dried tomato juice, but from the realization that what Taylor had just said wasn't just her own voice. It was the echo of a larger, deeper, more entrenched system. Taylor hadn't become this way by accident. She was the product of a culture where no one corrected her from the start, a place where her mocking laughter was never interrupted, a place where even someone like Cassidy, a woman with a conscience, chose silence, because saying something won't change anything. Cassidy tried to pivot the conversation, asking, "You switching shifts next month? I heard the Denver-San Diego route's overstaffed." Taylor replied, still sounding annoyed. "Probably gonna call in sick. I got concert tickets that week. Honestly, flights like this just wear me out. Passengers are annoying, food's cold, and management keeps preaching about customer experience. It's bull." Danielle logged it mentally. "Has a record of shift dodging, misusing personal leave, shows internal discontent, resistant to service policy." And then something made her tighten her grip. Taylor mentioned the CEO. "You ever seen that new CEO lady? Danielle Monroe? She looks kind of badass. Talks a good game too, but I bet she's never sat in economy a day in her life." People like that always go on about vision, core values, all while living hundreds of feet above ground level. Cassidy offered mildly, "I heard she started out on the ground crew." Taylor scoffed. "Oh, if that's true, she's forgotten all about it. 'Cause if she remembered, she wouldn't be making us work like this." Danielle's fingers clenched tighter on her lap. That comment, from the same woman who had just ridiculed her hoodie minutes earlier, was now aimed directly at her, and Taylor had no idea. It was all data. It was all evidence. Danielle no longer felt offended. She felt affirmed. She felt vindicated for not relying on filtered reports. She felt justified for launching Operation Horizon. And now she understood. The problem wasn't just one employee. It was a chain of wrong reactions that had been allowed to fester for far too long. The cabin had settled into a deceptive silence, where on the surface everything seemed to have calmed after the small incident in row 21. Passengers gradually returned to their private worlds. Some put their headphones back on, others opened their laptops, a few gently pulled the window shades to gaze at the thick white clouds outside. But for Danielle Monroe, that silence was nothing more than a thin shell over a storm slowly churning beneath. Outwardly, she remained still, appearing like just another passenger trying to shake off an unfortunate mishap. But inwardly, her mind was firing at full speed, operating like a radar system scanning for every interference in the air. She knew this flight had gone far beyond a routine internal assessment. It had become an unplanned test of culture, and what she needed most now was an anchor, not to react emotionally, but to execute the next step with precision. The rear lavatory door opened, and a tall man around 70 stepped out. He wore a dark gray tweed blazer, his shirt collar slightly wrinkled, and a pair of worn brown shoes that had clearly been polished with care. He walked with the composed gait of someone who had traveled often enough to no longer be rushed. He wasn't the type who stood out on a flight, unless you had once worked in the aviation industry or had heard his name before. Danielle knew it very well. That was Mr. Ellis Grant, former lead structural engineer from Skylinx's early design team, and a longtime friend of her father, the man who had quietly supported her from her internship days all the way to the stage where she was named CEO. Danielle had seen him during boarding, strolling behind a group of younger passengers. She recognized his posture from a distance, but maintained her anonymity. No greeting, no eye contact. But now, as he made his way back to seat 23D, just 2 rows behind her, that familiar gaze finally found her. That gaze was unmistakable. Sharp, intelligent, but always softened by a strange tenderness. The way he had always looked at her from behind the scenes. She gave a barely perceptible shake of her head. A small gesture, but with a clear message. Don't say anything. Don't acknowledge me. He understood instantly. Not a word, not a single expressive flicker. He continued walking, then paused beside her row for a seemingly innocent reason. He bent down to retrieve a white handkerchief that had accidentally fallen from his jacket pocket. As he stooped to pick it up, he tilted his head and whispered just loud enough for only her to hear. You all right? Danielle didn't look at him. She just tilted her head slightly and replied, I'm documenting. He smiled faintly and whispered back, I'd say, today's data is unusually rich. That offhand remark made the corner of Danielle's mouth twitch. Ellis understood the situation, and he was letting her know that he wasn't simply present on this flight as a passenger. He was a silent witness, and one with weight. Ellis resumed walking, gave a polite nod to the aisle passenger beside his seat, and sat down. Danielle knew she had just been handed an ace no one else at the table even knew was in play. Ellis wasn't just a veteran engineer. He was an honorary member of the National Aviation Advisory Council, whose remarks could be fed directly into the sector's quality evaluation protocols. Someone like him, if he chose to stand beside her, made the truth no longer a matter of opinion. It became something the system had to face. Over more than 2 decades in her career, Danielle had learned that cultural battles couldn't be won on emotion alone. They required evidence, witnesses, timing, and Ellis Grant had just become the final missing link that would help her shift from observer to executor. With someone like him who heard, who saw, she no longer had to carry the burden of remembering the incident alone. She had an ally, someone who understood how the system worked from the inside, someone immune to internal politics, and most importantly, someone with an independent voice too credible to be ignored. Ellis sat upright, pulled a small notebook from his blazer pocket, and took out a ballpoint pen. He began jotting something onto a blank page. Danielle couldn't see the content, but she knew it wasn't a travel journal. He was beginning to write the story she had just lived, through his lens, as a passenger who had seen the extraordinary beneath the ordinary. From the galley, the laughter and whispers from Taylor had vanished, replaced by quiet. Danielle guessed they were now on break, or had shifted to complaining about their shift, or perhaps gossiping about absent coworkers. Either way, she didn't need to hear more. She had enough, and she knew, Just one sentence from Ellis's notebook, written in the right place at the right time, could end Taylor's career entirely, even if Danielle's name remained unknown. She remembered all the times Ellis had sat in the shadows at her speaking events, quietly listening from backstage. He never praised her in front of the crowd, but after every event, he would slip her a note with just a few words. Keep the fire. Don't go soft. Remember where you came from. And now that gaze still held that same energy, reminding her that what she was doing today wasn't just about disciplining a disrespectful employee. It was about fulfilling the duty of leadership, protecting the core values she herself had once declared. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a few seconds to steady her pulse. There was still over an hour left on the journey from Denver to Seattle, but for her, the most important part of the flight had already taken place, and the one person she needed had arrived. The only difference was he didn't show up in a conference suit, didn't come with an entourage, didn't bring reports. He was sitting in seat 23D, silent, alone, but completely aware. In that moment of bending down to retrieve a handkerchief, he had confirmed to her that this battle would not be rewritten by the system. No one else on the flight knew that that small motion, just a man leaning down, was the moment that shifted this secret audit into an irrefutable file. A file with an independent witness, with verifiable facts, with harm documented without yelling, with truth that didn't need to be paraded to be believed. The flight continued in routine quiet, but for Danielle, this was the moment when everything truly changed. From the moment the captain announced that the plane was beginning its descent into Seattle airspace, the entire cabin grew tense in an oddly palpable way. No one spoke loudly, no one laughed, and all that remained were the soft hum of the engines, the click of seat belts, and the flight attendant's final reminders about seatbacks and tray tables. For most passengers, this was the closing stage of a flight. For Danielle Monroe, it was the beginning of a sequence of irreversible decisions. She didn't need to rush. She didn't need to get angry. She hadn't uttered a word since the incident, but she knew that with just one action after touchdown, everything would change permanently. She glanced back toward 23D. Mr. Ellis Grant still sat there, calm, his eyes on a small notebook half open in his lap, as if reviewing final notes before disembarking. He didn't look at her, but his presence alone reminded Danielle she wasn't alone. The forward curtain slid shut quietly. Taylor and Cassidy no longer moved through the cabin. There were no more whispers, no more giggles. They were huddled somewhere behind that fabric, cautious. They didn't know who she was, but they sensed something was off. The passengers' glances were no longer friendly toward them, and they had no way of knowing who had witnessed, who had heard, or who might have recorded something. But most importantly, they didn't know that the quiet woman in seat 21C was the one person who could end their entire career path with a single email. But Danielle didn't intend to write an email. Not today. She would make a call. Not a call made in anger. Not a customer complaint. It would be a professional report, brief but accurate, free of emotion, free of outrage, based only on facts and behavior. When the wheels touched down, all she would need was 45 seconds. And the person on the other end of the line would understand. The landing was smoother than she expected. No harsh bump, no aggressive braking. But in her mind, it marked the first real contact between observation and action. As the brakes slowed the aircraft, the cabin filled with small sounds, quiet sighs, bags being unzipped. The first text message pings now that signal had returned. Danielle remained seated. Her headphones were still on, though they played no music. Her right hand rested on her phone, unlocked. 3 steps, no hesitation. Open the internal app, select Protocol 7, press Call. A call with a dedicated identifier, used only in cases involving high-level behavioral monitoring or internal personnel misconduct. When the person on the other end picked up, there was no "hello," just a short request. State clearly, using format. Danielle responded without pause, every word as if pre-coded. Flight 928 from Denver to Seattle. Economy cabin, seat 21C. Incident occurred 1 hour, 14 minutes after takeoff. Primary subject, flight attendant Taylor Morrison. Behavior, mocking passenger, refusing assistance, implicit bias, unprofessional handling of liquid service. Witnesses, at least 4 nearby passengers, including senior advisor Ellis Grant in seat 23D. Evidence, first-hand confirmation, detailed observation, available upon request. Level, immediate investigation required, behavior monitoring within 48 hours, end, nothing more. No explanations, no punishment requests, no instructions. That's how people at the highest levels operate. They don't issue commands when they themselves are affected. They initiate the system and let it run. Danielle ended the call without looking around. She stood up as the others began gathering their luggage, composed, graceful, as if nothing had happened. Cassidy walked past, her eyes pausing for a few seconds on Danielle's face. It was unclear if she had realized anything, but it was obvious that she had felt something different about the woman's silence. Taylor did not appear. She remained in the galley, avoiding eye contact or waiting for the cabin to empty before emerging. Danielle pulled her suitcase from the row, neither rushed nor slow. Ellis Grant was waiting near the exit, like just another traveler who happened to land at the same destination. He nodded. Danielle nodded back. No words were exchanged. None were needed. She had made the call. He had written the notes. They were ready. As she stepped out of the cabin, the late afternoon sun in Seattle cast a soft glow onto the jet bridge floor, forming a faint shadow beneath her feet. One step off the plane, and Danielle knew. Everything from this point on would be different. Not because she was the CEO, but because she had done exactly what any passenger should have done. Reported wrongdoing when they saw it. The difference was, she knew the system on the other side wouldn't ignore it, because she had built that system herself. Within 6 hours of Flight 928 landing in Seattle, a chain of internal protocols had been silently activated. There was no commotion, no urgent all-staff email, no executive meeting, just a series of preset signals, operating like a Swiss watch. One component after another, quietly but with nothing escaping the system's scrutiny. Danielle Monroe wasn't at headquarters. She hadn't appeared on any camera system since leaving the airport, but she knew exactly what was unfolding. Everything had been pre-programmed the day she rebuilt Orion Air's internal oversight structure after the major reorganization 3 years prior. With a single tap on the Protocol 7 interface, every action, every piece of data, every related report was pulled into a controlled zone. Without warning. It began with cabin cameras. Every aircraft in Orion's fleet was equipped with smart video systems, not just for safety, but also to gather behavioral data for training purposes. From the overhead angle of the hidden camera in the front cabin, Taylor Morrison's actions were replayed frame by frame. The way she held the juice cup, the sideways glance at Danielle, the smirk, the look exchanged with Cassidy. This wasn't merely unprofessional behavior. It was a pattern of communication rooted in bias and alliance building. The automated voice recognition system isolated the galley conversation, even though it was whispered, because the cabin mic still registered all frequencies. The sentence, "She's sitting like that and still expects service?" from Cassidy, and probably another one of those entitled diversity cases from Taylor were both immediately flagged with red alerts. In Orion's internal behavior scoring system, any phrase suggesting racial, gender-based, or social class prejudice is encoded for early detection. The system also cross-referenced passenger feedback. Within 45 minutes of Protocol 7 being activated, 5 passenger comments had been submitted from those seated near rows 21 and 23. They didn't know the woman's identity, nor were they sure what had happened, but all of them described an unusually cold tone, a sense of disdain, an attitude as if targeting one specific passenger. One passenger even wrote, "I'm not sure why, but it was clear the attendant avoided engaging with the black woman in 21C while being very warm to everyone else." That data alone wasn't conclusive evidence, but when linked together, it became undeniable. And what triggered the shift from internal review to formal investigation wasn't just Taylor and Cassidy's behavior, it was their history. The system pulled up 18 months of records on both. Taylor Morrison had previously received 2 warnings for inappropriate tone with elderly passengers and delayed response to non-fluent English speakers. Cassidy had never been disciplined, but her name had surfaced in two previous negative reports involving black business class passengers who claimed they were served last. In both cases, the system lacked sufficient evidence, and the incidents were closed for lack of actionable data. But this time was different. The person reporting wasn't a regular passenger. It was Danielle Monroe, founder, CEO, and the architect of the entire high-level behavioral protocol. And most importantly, she hadn't requested disciplinary action. She had simply submitted the facts. That allowed the system to run without being compromised by personal authority. It ran purely on technical logic, exactly what Danielle had intended. No action based on emotion, no punishment to save face. Just the truth. Ellis Grant, seated in 23D, had quietly submitted a report through the private channel used by the Ethics and Operational Integrity Board. His report wasn't long, but every word was confirmation. He described the entire situation in objective, unbiased language, marking time, expressions, how Taylor responded when Danielle requested a new drink, and how Cassidy's smile carried undertones of contempt. He didn't recommend a sanction. He simply ended with one line: "We cannot tolerate a culture that belittles silent passengers." That single sentence was enough to escalate the case to urgent review. And at Orion headquarters, a wide-scale behavioral analysis was launched, not targeting individuals, but patterns. They began reviewing the entire flight attendant corps from the past 12 months, filtering for behavior patterns such as clustered service bias, inconsistent tone based on passenger profile, frequency of denial of assistance to vulnerable demographics, and even rate of overlooked passenger feedback when no loyalty card was scanned. A pattern began to emerge, not blatant on the surface, but deeply systemic. No one inside the organization had ever seen it so clearly, because everything had always seemed minor, isolated, dismissible, until now. Until a single undeniable case became the convergence point. Danielle was that point, and ironically, she didn't need to exert an ounce of executive power to take action. She had simply used the system she had built, quietly, precisely, without confrontation. The HR training division was instructed to suspend all regular sessions for 72 hours to receive and process the new data. A cultural audit task force was formed immediately. Meanwhile, Taylor and Cassidy, still unaware, believed they were in the clear. They laughed after the flight. They chatted as if nothing had happened. But data doesn't laugh. And truth, even when buried in silence for years, will always speak again when someone is steady enough to listen. When Taylor Morrison received the call at 9:13 a.m. on Monday, she was standing in front of her mirror, straightening the tie of her freshly pressed flight attendant uniform. She didn't think much of it. A call from HR wasn't unusual. She'd received a few in the past, mostly about flight schedule adjustments or routine performance check-ins. But this voice was different. It wasn't HR. It was an administrative assistant from the Executive Governance Office. Her tone was soft. "Ms. Morrison, the 39th floor would like to see you at 11 a.m. today." No explanation. No additional details. Not overly polite, not threatening either. Just neutral. So neutral it sent a chill down Taylor's spine. She stood frozen for a moment in front of the mirror. The 39th floor. That wasn't a place for people like her. No one from the cabin crew had ever been invited to the 39th floor, unless something was very wrong. Taylor tried to steady herself. Maybe it was a mix-up. Maybe it was an internal survey. Maybe, she didn't know. But the uneasy feeling lingered even as she stepped into the elevator at 10:56 a.m. The Orion Air headquarters in downtown Seattle had 42 floors. The 39th floor was called the Quiet Zone. Not because it was literally silent, but because no one dared speak much once they stepped onto it. Taylor stood in the elevator, watching the numbers rise. 23 to 27, then 31, then 36. With each ding, her chest tightened. When the elevator finally stopped, it felt like being pulled into a spotlight. The doors opened, not into a hallway, but into a wood-paneled waiting room, dimly lit, subtly scented with cinnamon and orange peel. A young woman in a black blazer approached and said nothing except, "Please come with me." Taylor followed her like someone being led into custody. She felt the weight of her shoes turn to stone, sweat beginning to bead behind her neck. The room they entered wasn't large. A round table. 8 people seated already. No one smiled, no one spoke. They didn't look like a disciplinary board. They didn't look like HR either. They looked like people who already knew everything and were waiting for her to confirm the undeniable. Taylor was offered a seat. Her chair was slightly lower than the others. She wasn't sure if that was by accident or design. The man at the head of the table began. "Good morning, Ms. Morrison. Today we'd like you to share your experience on Flight 928 last Friday." Taylor swallowed hard. She tried not to appear rattled, but her heart pounded like a war drum. She began to speak, her voice steady, trying to maintain pace. She said the flight had gone smoothly. She didn't recall anything unusual. She claimed to have performed her duties according to protocol. She made no mention of the passenger in seat 21C. No one in the room reacted. No one took notes. They just looked at her, as if they had already seen the original version of this film and were now waiting to see if she could reenact it convincingly. A woman seated to the left of the table asked, "Do you remember the female passenger in seat 21C?" Taylor flinched slightly. "I'm not sure," she replied, her voice lower. "She asked for a new juice, didn't she?" The woman pressed. Taylor bit her lip. "She might have. I don't remember exactly." The man at the head of the table opened an iPad, rotating it to show a still image from the cabin camera. "Are you sure you don't remember?" Taylor was silent. There was no way out now. The images showed her holding the juice cup, her hand tilted, her expression cold. Another person spoke. "You're aware we reviewed the full audio from the galley, yes?" Taylor felt her knees weaken. She couldn't speak. A younger woman, likely from the Internal Ethics Office, gently placed a printed transcript on the table. "We didn't invite you here to argue. We just want you to understand. Our system misses no one." The room fell silent. And then, the man at the head of the table tilted slightly, signaling to someone behind Taylor. She turned around. The woman from seat 21C was sitting at the far end of the table, hands resting calmly on a closed notebook. No uniform, no badge, no expression of anger, just the eyes. Those eyes that pinned Taylor to her seat like a nail to wood. Danielle Monroe didn't need an introduction. Anyone who had been at Orion long enough knew her face. But Taylor had never imagined, never even considered, that the quiet woman from that flight, the one she had dismissed with a glance, was the very person who now held her future in her hands. Danielle said nothing for the first 3 minutes. Then she placed a hand on her notebook. She didn't question. She didn't accuse. She simply recounted in a low, steady voice what she had experienced during that flight. "I've been a passenger, like anyone else. I used to be a flight attendant, like you. I've stood in that narrow galley with my hands numb from cabin pressure. I understand fatigue. I understand pressure. But I will never accept a culture where complicit silence becomes standard practice." Taylor stared down at the table. Danielle continued, "I didn't come here to eliminate you. I came to ask, what makes someone believe they have the right to treat others as lesser simply because they don't look like them?" No one said anything after that. The entire room felt suspended in that silence, a silence heavier than any sentence. The man at the head of the table finally spoke. "Ms. Morrison, we are placing you on temporary suspension while a formal investigation is conducted. This is not a conclusion, but it is the beginning." Taylor stood up, walking out of the room like someone who had lost all sense of direction. As the door closed behind her, she could no longer hear the elevator chime or the soft breeze from the hallway vents. All she could hear was one echo in her head, the gaze of the woman she had once deemed unimportant, now rewriting the very system she once thought untouchable. Friday, Orion Air Headquarters, Floor 5A, Main Press Room, 8:57 a.m. Under the cool white overhead lighting, dozens of camera lenses were being mounted and fine-tuned one last time. Reporters from Bloomberg, CNN, AP, and even a few independent bloggers were already in place. Some spoke in low voices, most agreeing. This would be one of the most closely watched press conferences of the year in the airline industry. Leaked internal headlines, unverified audio clips, and stills pulled from Flight 928's cabin footage had placed Orion's leadership under an unprecedented wave of public scrutiny. Everyone assumed today would follow a predictable script. Orion's CEO, Harold Gantz, would step up, lower his head, deliver a statement, and field a barrage of difficult questions. But no one expected that when the clock struck exactly 9 a.m. and the microphone echoed, "May I have your attention?" The person who stepped onto the stage wasn't him. A woman in an ivory blouse and dark blue trousers. No company badge. No high heels. No heavy makeup. Her hair was tied back, her gaze steady, neither cast downward nor forced into artificial poise. Danielle Monroe walked onto the stage holding a folded sheet of paper, not a typed speech. She stood still for 3 seconds at the microphone. The room fell completely silent. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't say hello or thank you for coming. She looked straight into the row of press seats and began with one line. "I sat in seat 21C. No one reacted right away. It wasn't until she continued, in a calm but unwavering tone, that the room fell into deeper stillness. "I wasn't screamed at. I wasn't dragged from my seat. I didn't have visible injuries. But I left that flight with a feeling many of you in this room, perhaps, have never experienced. The feeling of being made invisible. Every eye in the room was now fixed on her. Danielle never mentioned Taylor. She never detailed the incident. She didn't cite camera footage. She didn't play audio. She told her story from experience, not accusation. I asked for juice. They gave me an old half-used cup. I pointed it out. No one responded. I spoke softly. They told me I should be quiet. I looked up and saw someone laughing. Not because anything was funny, but because they believed I wasn't important enough to warrant a response." She paused, then continued. "If I'd been an elderly woman with gray hair, wearing a floral blouse and carrying a canvas bag, I think I would have been ignored too. If I'd been a young man in a tailored suit with blonde hair, I probably would have received an immediate apology. The issue wasn't me. It was how we default, without realizing, to deciding who deserves to be heard and who doesn't." A faint tap echoed across the table, just a reporter unconsciously drumming their fingers. Danielle glanced toward it, then continued. "I used to be a flight attendant. I know how tight the cabin is. I know the pressure. I know there are days when you just want to get through the shift without anyone making it harder. But those are exactly the moments when kindness matters most." She raised the paper in her hand. "This isn't a speech. It's a note I wrote to myself after stepping off that flight. It doesn't have an action plan. It just has one line. Don't let today's silence become tomorrow's standard." Some people began to take notes. Others stopped. Danielle didn't ask anyone to do anything. But the air in the room was shifting, slowly, palpably. She lowered the paper and glanced at the large screen behind her, now displaying the phrase, "Orion listens." Then she said, "We don't change because we're forced to. We change because it's the right thing to do. And today, instead of saying, 'It wasn't that serious,' we say, 'It did happen, and it won't happen again.'" She then announced 7 policy changes. 1. Establishment of an independent passenger experience review board with actual passengers as members. 2. Full retraining of all flight attendants in bias-free interaction. 3. Scheduled cabin camera audits, not for surveillance, but to improve internal culture. 4. Passenger feedback systems will now offer anonymous submissions that must be formally reviewed. 5. The Internal Ethics Office will include representatives from all levels of staff, not just management. 6. A monthly award titled "The Quiet Kindness" will be given to staff recognized by passengers. And 7. Orion will partner with community organizations to build a new metric called Systemic Silence Index to measure patterns of being overlooked in service industries. Danielle didn't end with a slogan, no logo, no applause line. She simply said, "I don't need anyone to apologize to me, but I want this industry to apologize to those who were treated poorly and never had the chance to stand here like I do." Then she stepped down. No music, no applause. But a new kind of silence began to spread. Not the silence of apathy, the silence of reflection. By 9 p.m. that evening, the video of Danielle Monroe's press conference had spread across all major social media platforms. Within 6 hours of her stepping off the stage, The original clip had surpassed 12 million views. On Twitter, hashtags began trending. Number 21C, Danielle Monroe, Orion listens, silence no more. National TV networks like NBC, ABC, Fox News, and CBS all ran coverage. Some PR experts called it one of the most emotionally impactful statements ever made by a figure in the airline industry in the past decade. But what surprised the media most was this. Danielle Monroe wasn't a CEO, wasn't a chairperson, wasn't on the board of directors. She held no official title beyond the passenger who said what no one else dared to. That same night, on the 39th floor of Orion Air headquarters, the executive board held an emergency meeting under a heavy atmosphere. Harold Gantz, the CEO, sat at the head of the table, his face tight and strained. No one spoke as the conference room doors closed. An assistant began presenting a series of slides, charts showing soaring positive public feedback, with support for the Number Orion Listens campaign rising by 870% in just 6 hours. But at the same time, shareholders had received a leaked email, an internal message from Taylor Morrison, the chief flight attendant on Flight 928. The email, sent 2 days before the press conference, read, "There's no need to escalate this. That passenger wasn't offended. She's just trying to make a big deal out of nothing so she can feel mistreated." The leak came from an HR staff member, someone who had previously witnessed multiple complaints about Taylor, but saw them all swept under the rug. Not this time. The media moved quickly, and when words like cover-up, dismissive, and manipulating complaints began appearing across Reddit, Facebook, and LinkedIn, Orion's leadership could no longer remain silent. One board member, Carol Silverman, slammed her hand on the table. "We can't keep Ms. Morrison, not because of what she did on that flight, but because of how she chose to deny responsibility afterward." Another voice joined in, a shareholder representative from California, adding, "If we don't act decisively, every ethical promise we made today becomes meaningless." Harold Gantz, who had remained quiet until then, finally spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it was cold. "I will sign the termination of Ms. Morrison, effective immediately." No one objected, but then came the question that froze the room. "And what about you, Harold?" The question came from Greg Tanaka, the youngest member of the board. Greg pointed at the screen replaying Danielle's walk to the stage and highlighted a graph. Data shows that internal staff trust in the current CEO has dropped from 71% to 34% in just 48 hours. No one believes anymore that this change originated from the executive level. They believe, and they're right, that it began with a woman who was dismissed, and that means trust in leadership has eroded at a cultural level. A vote was proposed not to fire Harold Gantz, but to remove him from direct oversight of all cultural policy decisions at the company. Instead, an independent internal advisory council would be formed, and Danielle Monroe was invited to serve as honorary chair. But when the invitation hit her inbox, her response came quickly. "I'm honored, but I must decline. I don't want a seat at the round table. I want to stay by the door, where I can hear the voices of those still being ignored." That reply circulated internally among staff and quickly became a symbolic quote. On Slack, an employee added it to their email signature. On LinkedIn, it became the headline of a post shared over 200,000 times. The following day, Orion released an official statement. "Ms. Taylor Morrison is no longer an employee of Orion Air as of the 12th of this month. We respect privacy, but we also respect justice." There were no photos of Taylor leaving headquarters, no farewell gathering. She vanished from the organizational chart as if she had never existed. But no one celebrated, because the issue was never about just one person. It was about an entire system that had allowed that mindset to thrive unchecked for far too long. Danielle didn't appear in the media again, but when a reporter later emailed her asking, "Who do you think delivered the verdict?" her reply was brief. "Not me. It was all the people who've ever been dismissed without a voice. I was just the microphone they never had." 2 weeks after the press conference, Danielle Monroe had not made another public appearance. No exclusive interviews, no tell-all articles. She disappeared from the spotlight as if she had never stepped onto that stage. But that silence only made her impact louder. Orion Air quietly announced a new internal initiative, No press conference, no banners. Just a single email sent to all employees with a plain subject line. Monroe Protocol, Phase 1. In that email, there was no mention of the scandal, no mention of Taylor Morrison, no rallying cry. It simply said, "We begin again," from the inside. The project bore her name, but Danielle had no part in it. She declined any official role. Yet on the 18th floor of Orion's headquarters, a small group had been formed. It included 3 HR managers, 2 veteran flight attendants, 1 psychologist, and a college intern who had just completed their practicum. The same intern who had written an impressive essay titled Cabin Class versus Human Class. This group wasn't tasked with crisis resolution, but with proposing a new concept, identifying moments vulnerable to unconscious bias, and responding to them properly. They didn't draft rigid rules. Instead, they recalled small, overlooked incidents, like a flight attendant sighing at the sight of a passenger wearing a hoodie, an agent only offering wine to white guests, or when a flight attendant called an elderly woman sweetheart without realizing she was in uniform, wearing an old military jacket. Things no one thought were wrong, but that quietly fractured trust over time. The first training manual of the Monroe Protocol had no 3D graphics, no multiple-choice quizzes. It contained a stack of printed papers outlining 21 real-life situations and a single question at the top. If you were sitting in seat 21C, would you stand up? A young flight attendant, Cassidy, read through the packet in the crew rest area during a layover. When she turned to the last page, there was a small handwritten note in strong, deliberate script. When someone is silent, don't assume they're weak. They may be observing. They may be the reason the whole system changes. There was no signature. But at the bottom corner, in slanted writing, it said 21C. Cassidy held the note for a long while. She didn't know much about Danielle beyond what the news had said. But in her heart, she understood. Power wasn't a requirement for making change. A timely glance, a precisely spoken word, an act that didn't need a microphone. That's what shaped the Monroe Protocol. In a later training session a month afterward, an airport security staff member shared that he had once stopped an elderly woman thinking she was lost, when in fact she was simply finding her way to the first-class counter. He said, "I remembered 21C, and this time I stepped aside." His story was published in Orion's internal newsletter under the headline, "The Protocol Isn't a Document, It's a Stance." Somewhere in the city of Dallas, Danielle Monroe lived quietly with her family. She didn't attend any award ceremonies. But one rainy afternoon, she received a handwritten letter from an 11-year-old girl named Alina. "Ms. Monroe, I used to be scared when flying alone to visit my dad. I heard the adults talking about 21C. I didn't understand everything, but I knew. You didn't yell. You didn't fight. You didn't walk away. And because you did that, I'm not afraid anymore to speak up when I see something." The letter was laminated and tucked into Danielle's desk drawer, next to an old boarding pass, seat 21C. And by that winter, other airlines began quietly releasing internal drafts inspired by the Monroe Protocol. No one forced them. No law required it. But they knew it was time to change, not for reputation, but for something deeper. Respect should never be a privilege. It should be the standard. This story began with a single glance and ended with a system taught how to look again. And perhaps the most remarkable thing wasn't that an unknown woman changed the course of an entire airline. It was that she did it without shouting, without a title, and without anyone apologizing on her behalf. She simply stayed seated, observed, and spoke up about what she saw. Sometimes you don't need to take the stage. You just need to stay in your seat when everything around you says you should get up. And then the whole system, the little world around you, is forced to take a hard look at itself. If this story made you feel warmer, more compassionate, or even angry on behalf of those who've been quietly hurt, leave a comment below. We want to know, who were you on that flight? The one who stayed silent? The witness? Or the person who once sat in 21C? And if you believe there are still stories like this that deserve to be told, of quiet strength and justice that doesn't need to scream, hit subscribe so you won't miss the next video. Because here, we don't just tell stories, we give a voice back to those who were once forced to stay silent.